Today we will going to discuss a new topic, classification and classification data. So, definition of classification: arranging data in groups, classes on the basis of certain properties is called as data classification. Another definition of classification is: classification is the process of arranging data into sequences and groups according to their common characteristics or separating them into different but related to parts. So, in our daily life we can use this classification of data. Why? Because classification regarding so on attributes. For example, if I give one example for in this classification, age group, particular age 0 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, we can split the data into certain groups. And sex for either male category or female category, state, which states this candidate belongs to, religion, heights or weights, etc. These are the classifications. So, many classifications we have. What is the use of these classifications? Using this classification we will get a lot of information. For example, in your class, how many students are, what are the total strength, how many students are boys, number of students related to classifications, classification related to boys or girls, how many boys in your class, how many girls in your class. This is a one type of classification. How many students comes under certain category of students, height based and height based or weight based, these are the certain classifications. Okay. So, the main objective of data classification are basically the contents of raw data, and second one is the reveal the patterns of the variables, to compare and find some facts between the groups, to establish relation between the groups or variables, to present data in orderly from statistical analysis. The main objective of classification is, so main theme is to find the data according to classification. So, better classification provide to us better statistical analysis. Why? Because if you are taking the wrong classification, we are not getting the sufficient information. That is why the main objective of data classification is, if you are taking the correct classification, we will get the correct information. If you get the correct information, we will get good statistical investigation or further scope, will implement the results in correct manner. That is why this classification is very useful, any statistical analysis. So, that is why the present data in orderly form for statistical analysis. Okay. So, you have to use many variables, many data, the data should be arranged in proper form. That is why this classification is useful for conducting or collecting the data. After collecting the data, we should organize the data appropriate form. So, what is the use? So, afterwards we have certain rules for classifying the data. That means, now we are talking about rules for classification of data. So, raw data will not give any information regarding the characteristics of the data. The first step in statistical analysis of classification of data is to classify data, and we should follow the following guidelines. That means, what I said earlier also, this in statistical analysis, the classification of data is very much useful, because if you are taking the correct classification, we will get good information. So, that is why this classification of data, we should follow certain rules for classifying the data. Now, here rules for classifying the data, basically we have used unambiguous, exhaustive, stability, suitable for the purpose and flexibility. These are the key points, rules for classifying the data. So, we will discuss one by one. We will discuss one by one in that case. Okay. So, rules for classifying the data. Now, first one is unambiguous, that means the class should be rigid, and unambiguous, that means clear, and unclear classification cannot have severe consequences can also impact all the further statistical treatments. What I said earlier, same thing. That means if your information is not in clear form, we can't draw any statistical inference. The further investigation is goes to loss. That means we cannot implement our results in real time environment. That is why your data should be rigidly defined. Your classification should be rigid. Now, second category is exhaustive. We can follow second rule is exhaustive. Every classified data must be exhaustive in the sense that they should belongs to one of the classes or category or categories. If the more number of data classifications we have, it becomes classes increase or categories will be increase. So, then third rule for stability. Stability means, what is the meaning of stability? That means in order to facilitate effective comparison of data, it is important that classified data are stable. Classified data are stable. Okay. Now, classified data should be stable in the sense that the same classification pattern must be adopted throughout the analysis. All of a sudden you can change your stability in this classification. So, we cannot interpret any results. That is why the data classification should be stability. If you have the stability, if you collect that information stability manner, that should be clear. So, that is why adopting different classification technique for the same analysis would be lead to ambiguity. That means it is not clear, it will get so many confusions in the data. That is why your classification should have a stability. That is one of the foremost role in this classification. Next, suitable for the purpose. Already you know the aim of your study. Already you define the problem. That is why only you collect the information, that data is classified in this certain manner. In that case, we can use suitable purpose. That it is crucial to remember the objective of the report or analysis while classifying data. Avoid classifying the data in a manner that not suit the purpose of the inquiry. So, what I am saying here once again, avoid classifying the data in a manner that does not suit for the purpose of the inquiry. So, that is why it is a crucial remember of the objective. If you can remember your objective, based on that objective only you should classify the data. Okay. So, these are the one more important flexibility, one more rule for in this classification you have to remember, that is flexibility. It is important to classify the data in a manner that allows future modifications. Due to changing conditions, there may arise the need to change the statistical methods and data classifications. In such a situation, a flexible classification of data would solve many issues. So, these are the guidelines for classification of data. Now, we have different types of classifications. So, the following types of classification techniques we use for data classification. Basically, we have 4 types of classifications. First one is temporal classification, second one is spatial classification, third one is quantitative classification, and fourth one is qualitative classification. Let us discuss clearly one by one. First one is what amma? Here we have four types of classifications. You have to remember this: temporal classification, spatial classification, quantitative classification, qualitative classifications. These are the basic types of classifications. Now, we will discuss one by one. First one is temporal classification. Okay. So, temporal classification, what is the definition of, actually what is the meaning of temporal classification? If the classification basis is time, you have to remember, I use the word time is very important here. If the classification of basis is time, then such classification is called temporal classification. The basic definition of temporal classification is, if the classification basis is time, then such classification is called temporal classification. Example for temporal classification, general example, temporal classification population of India. Population of India regarding means over 100 years, we can calculate the population 1990 to 2000, what is the population? 2000 to 2010, what is the population? 2010 to 2020, what is the population of India? That means particular time period, we collect the information in particular time period, that is known as a temporal classification. Based on the time only we can collect the information. So, this is a clear idea about the temporal classification. I will give one more example for in that case, temporal classification. For example, in temporal classification, for example, profit of a company over the years, population of a country over a years, revenue generating by an organization over the months, etc., representing temporal classification. This classification is also known as chronological classification. The temporal classification another name is chronological classification. According to time period it will occur. For example, in this here I have given one example for you here and populations, population in crores 2002, 25 crores approximately 25.8 crores, 2003 43.2 crores. So, have observed this 2022, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. Particular time period, the population is you can check. So, that means if you given the classification is like this, now you can check the trend also, it is increasing manner only. 2002 your classified data is 25 crores almost, now it is 2010 it is 80 crores. Arrange the data in chronological order, that is a chronological classification. Based on the time we can arrange the data, that is known as a temporal classification. Okay. So, this is one of the example in that case. Now, coming to second one, according to classification, second one is spatial classification. So, what do you mean by spatial classification? This is if the basis of the classification is geographical regions, then such a classification is called spatial classification. So, what is the meaning of spatial classification? What is the definition of spatial classification? If the basis of the classification is geographical regions, then such classification is called spatial classification. For example, population density in different cities, sales of company in different regions of a city, rainfall statistics of different regions, etc., represent the spatial classifications. Rainfall in last 10 years in Telangana state, in terms of district wise also, if you want to record the data in terms of, that is comes under spatial classification. Based on the geographical region we should collect the information. This is the one of the example for the population density in the different cities. So, what is the population density right now in Hyderabad, population density in Warangal, population density on throughout different cities. So, this because we are using the geographical regions. Population density in India, population density in Russia, population density in America, this type of classifications, these are comes under geographical regions. Okay. This type of classification is known as spatial classification. Now, for example, sales of TVs in various regions given in the table. This is the one of the time regions only now, different cities. Regions are what in terms of Nellore, Vijayawada, Warangal, Karimnagar, Hyderabad. Sales of TVs in Nellore is, for example, we are taking the data from 1010, Vijayawada is 1300, Warangal is 1200, Karimnagar is 1121 and Hyderabad is 6034. That means regions are different regions, our classified data is region wise and sales of TVs in different regions. So, region to this region, the data should be vary. If your data belongs to that type of data do you have, in that case we can go for this type of arrangement, this type of classification you can make. This is the one type of classification. Now, another one is sales of products in different regions, figures in numbers. So, product here, region, products, different regions we are consider here, Hyderabad, Secunderabad, Khammam, Nalgonda, Warangal, and product 1, product 2, product 3. This is also one type of classification. Yes or no? So, this is a regions, we have different regions here. In that region, how that product is going on, sales is going on in this way. From the table, we can observe that product 1 in Hyderabad is 200, product 1 in Secunderabad is 100, Khammam 150, Nalgonda 100, Warangal 150, total is 700. Now, product 2 in different cities like Hyderabad is 300, Secunderabad is 400, Khammam 200, Nalgonda 150, Warangal 100 and total is 150. Like that product 3 is also we have here. So, 600 from Hyderabad, 500 from Secunderabad, 400 from Khammam and 300 from Nalgonda and 200 from Warangal. So, now you have to take the Hyderabad city what is the total and you can take the row total and column total. This classification gives a clear idea about the figures in numbers, how sales of products in different regions. If your table should be rigidly defined, everyone can easily understand. That is why one is the foremost important statistical technique is, if you take the correct measurements, correct classifications, then we can easily analyze the data. So, that is why this is one of the foremost important classification. So, third one is classification of qualitative data and then followed by fourth one is classification of quantitative data. Okay. So, now we are talking about qualitative data. What do you mean by qualitative? Qualitative in terms of, not in terms of numbers. Sometimes your classification, sometimes you are not getting the numbers. In that case, my XYZ perception is data in opinion is different, my opinion is different, X person is opinion is different. In that case, that previous classifications are not fit for us, fit for the data classification. In that case, we can use some qualitative data analysis techniques. If the classification basis is sum of attributes, earlier also one is time based, another one is geographical, and third one is coming to classification is basis is some attributes like honesty, kindness, gender, literacy, region, occupation, etc., which cannot be quantified. Why? Because honesty, your opinion is different, my opinion is different. If you want to measure honesty, that is why data cannot be quantified. Then that classification is called qualitative classification. If the classification is basis is some attribute like honesty, kindness, gender, literacy, region, occupation, etc., which cannot be quantified, then that classification is called qualitative classification. Okay. So, now we will give few example in that case. To classify qualitative data, we construct a frequency distribution. Why? Because quantitative honesty, how to measure the honesty? How many people are giving the some grading system, rating system, and gender means what is the gender? Gender male category, female category. That means how many falls under in the male category, how many falls under female category. So, in that case we can use the frequency distribution. Okay. To classify qualitative data, we construct a frequency distribution. Frequency distribution represents various attributes observed in the data and number of times each attribute is repeated, which is also called frequency. Frequency means it is a which number is repeated, how many number of times one person is expressed their opinion. repeated, which is attribute is repeated, how many number of times that attribute is repeated, that concept is known as frequency. So, frequency plays a vital role in classification of qualitative data. So, following examples, I can take one example in that qualitative data. So, that means the following table shows satisfaction of the data collected from randomly from the 113 guests stayed in hotel and customers visited a hotel. Satisfying rating, number of guests, very much dissatisfied 13 members, dissatisfied, only dissatisfied 12 members, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied 34 members, satisfied 42, very much satisfied. Like this, where classification is like this, rating is given. So, that means what I said earlier. So, it is the opinion of the person, his perception is given very much dissatisfied. My opinion, I can satisfied, like that. If I have opinions, means that opinion we can't measure. In that case, we can take attributes. That attribute gives the how many number of times that persons are dissatisfied and satisfied. That numbers are treated as a number of guests, repeated number. That repeated number is known as a frequency. Okay. Next, quantitative classification, fourth category. Quantitative classification, the classification of data is based on some characteristics which can be measured, such as height, weight, distance, income, etc. Can be quantified. The classification based on such phenomena is called quantitative classification. When the classification of data is based on some characteristic which can be measured. For example, if we want to know what is the class average height of students in your class, we can measure all the members' heights and weights, income of the family, distances from X city to Y city can be quantified. So, this type of data comes under quantitative classification. Okay. So, what do you mean? What I am trying to say here, what do you mean by quantitative classification? The qualification based on such phenomena is called quantitative classification. Example, the following table shows a frequency distribution. For example, number of children, number of families, 0 children in 15 families, only 1 children in 34 families, 2 children in 76 families, 3 children in 23 families, 4 children in 10 families. This type of classification, that means repeated numbers, no children means 0 children, that is the number of families. The number of families, how many number of families is repeated? 15. This 15 is known as a frequency. How the frequencies distribution is going on here? 15, 34, 76, 23. So, this is the example for the frequency distribution. Now, variables. While talking about this frequency distribution, we will talk about the variables also. The quantitative phenomena under study is known as variable. The variables are two kinds. Continuous and discrete variables. What do you mean by continuous variable? Continuous variables. What do you mean by continuous variable? Which take all possible values. Is known as a continuous variable. Discrete variables which cannot take all possible values, that is discrete variable. Now, in frequency distribution, one of the most common way of grouping data is through the use of frequency distribution. A frequency distribution divides the data into several orders, non-overlapping classes or groups or categories. That means, a frequency distribution divides the data into several orders, non-overlapping the classes or groups or categories. Raw data collected needs to be grouped together in a meaningful way. One of those meaningful presentation of the data is frequency distribution. Frequency distribution. Earlier we are taking the example, number of children in a family, 0, no children in a family, that is the one of the frequency. Okay. So, we can organize the data, the frequency distribution is organized, the classification data is organized in well manner. The number of observations in each class is known as a frequency. That means, earlier example is what is the frequency? Number of children, 4, number of above 4. How many families having the 4 children? 4 number of 4 children, that is one of the frequency. That means, the number of observations in each class is known as a frequency. A table which represents value or classes and their frequency is called frequency distribution. A frequency distribution tells us how values are distributed over the classes. We need to understand the process of converting data into a frequency distribution. Now, frequency distribution for a qualitative data. Frequency distribution for a qualitative data. To summarize qualitative data, we construct a frequency distribution. In this case, we identify these attributes which are repeating themselves continuously in the data and we arrange them in a table with corresponding frequency. Here, frequency is a number of times each attribute is repeated, already I discussed, which is called a frequency distribution. For example, a guest staying at a 3-star hotel, we asked here to rate quality of their accommodation as being excellent, above average, average, below average or poor. So, this is the one example, we are asking the excellent, this is also one of this, how many times that person, number of guests saying excellent, which is the number, okay, which we should convert it into frequency distribution form. So, now we are talking one more important frequency distribution, relative frequency distribution. Relative frequency. We might want to compare the various opinions of the guest in the example. We might express the same information instead of frequencies with relative importance of each rating. We convert the above frequency distribution into relative frequency distribution. We calculate relative frequency by dividing the respective category frequencies by total number of observation. The sum of relative frequencies is equal to 1 always. Okay. So, today's topic is what? Now, let us conclude the session. So, we are talking about classification. So, what do you mean by classification? How many types of classifications we have with examples and frequency distribution. These are the basic topics now we are discussed. Okay. So, these are the few based on the time, based on the chronological order and based on the quality, based on the quantity, we will classify the data. So, this data, using this data we should go for further statistical analysis. That is why this classification is important.